Jasmine Crockett sat still in the dressing room at CBS Television City in Los Angeles, elbows resting gently on the armrest, her phone screen dimming in her palm. The air in the room wasn't cold in temperature, but it carried the chill of detachment. Over-sanitized, too polished, the kind of space that had been prepared 1,000 times before, yet never truly made ready for the person inside it. A young assistant had just walked out after reminding her, politely but without warmth, that she had 10 minutes before going live on Real Time with Maher. Jasmine took a breath, not to calm her nerves, because this wasn't her first time in front of a national audience, but because something about this night felt different. It wasn't the studio, the schedule, or even the stakes. It was the silence she had walked into. No water offered, no handshake from the other guest, just muffled voices down the hall, laughter that stopped abruptly when she stepped into the green room, replaced by a stillness that said more than words ever could. 2 days earlier, her communications director had called with a tone she recognized all too well. "They're calling it a discussion on polarization and civility," he'd warned. "But if Maher goes where I think he might, they're going to bait you. Just be ready." Jasmine had heard it before, the coded caution, the way certain invitations weren't really invitations, but traps set under the guise of debate. Still, she came. Because showing up, especially when it was uncomfortable, was part of the job. Her assistant Reese leaned through the door. 2 minutes. Jasmine stood, smoothed the lines of her powder blue blazer, crisp clean, no flash, no distraction, and glanced at her reflection. No cracks, no room for them, not tonight. As she walked toward the set, she passed the black and white portraits of men along the hallway. Icons, they called them. Men in suits, men with opinions, men who had never once had to consider softening their voice so they wouldn't be labeled angry on cable television. When she reached the stage, Maher gave her a nod, not quite a smile, and gestured toward her seat like he was trying to hold in a joke he wasn't ready to share. The lights came up, the applause sign blinked, the theme music cued, and just like that, they were live. "Our next guest is a rising Democratic congresswoman from Texas," Maher announced with a half smile. "She's young, sharp, and possibly the future of the party, unless emotion gets in the way." A few chuckles scattered from the audience. Jasmine didn't blink. She crossed her legs, folded her hands calmly, and responded, "Good to be here." Her voice was measured, steady. Maher leaned forward. "Let's start simple. Why do so many progressives these days feel the need to moralize everything?" Jasmine didn't answer right away. She blinked slowly, then gave a slight nod, not out of confusion, but calculation. She had expected this. She always expected this. "Moralizing, huh?" she said lightly. "I think you mean standing up for people who usually don't get heard." Maher smirked. "Right, but don't you think sometimes passion gets in the way of governing? There's a lot of yelling, not a lot of results. It's like everyone's trying to go viral instead of get things done." Another round of awkward chuckles rippled through the audience. Jasmine still didn't smile. "I get it," she replied calmly. "Young people, especially young women, especially young black women, get labeled emotional when we care too much or angry when we speak directly. Meanwhile, someone else can curse on air and it's called passion. Interesting, isn't it?" Maher shifted in his seat. "You're making this about identity. I'm talking about approach. People want solutions, not lectures." Jasmine leaned in slightly. "And I'm telling you, you can't separate identity from approach. If someone spends their life watching their community be underfunded, overlooked, blamed for problems they didn't create, what do you expect them to sound like when they finally get the mic? Soft?" The room tightened. The audience quieted, not from discomfort, but anticipation. Maher raised an eyebrow. "But isn't that the problem? The mic's become a weapon instead of a tool. Every moment's a chance to clap back. I mean, it's almost like Congress is a stage now." Jasmine chuckled softly, not because it was funny, but because the setup was too easy. "You know what's wild?" she said. "It's always been a stage. You just didn't notice when the same people were writing every act, but now someone new is reading from the script, and suddenly it's performative." A breath in the audience, audible now. Someone muttered, "Whoa." Heads turned. The camera lingered on Maher's face just long enough to catch the flicker in his expression. He reached for his water. Okay," he said, regaining his pace. So let's take the emotion out of it. Policy-wise, what's actually being done? Jasmine didn't miss a beat. Depends, she said. Do you mean what's being proposed or what's being blocked? Maher tilted his head. Explain. She did. Take voting rights. I helped draft legislation that would make it easier for working people to vote, more polling places, stronger mail-in options, protections for people with disabilities. That's not emotional. That's structural. But every time we bring it up, we're accused of overreaching. So I'm asking, who's really holding progress back? Maher shrugged. Maybe it's just not that simple. Jasmine didn't blink. No, she said plainly. It is that simple. What's complicated is justifying systems that work for some people while pretending they work for everyone. The audience murmured. The rhythm had changed. This wasn't banter. This wasn't a sparring match disguised as civility. This was something deeper. And only one of them looked comfortable in it. Maher crossed his legs again, gave a tighter smile. Sounds like a good soundbite, he said. Jasmine stayed steady. Maybe. Or maybe it just sounds different because I didn't need to raise my voice to make the point. But she knew what was coming next. It wasn't going to be a question. It would be a swing. Maher leaned back, the smirk slipping into something cooler, more calculated. He tapped the armrest once, twice. Well, he said, you talk a lot about how hard it is for women like you, but isn't part of leadership being able to take criticism without calling it oppression? The silence in the room wasn't empty, it was charged. The kind of silence that happens when someone touches a nerve and doesn't realize the current will shock them. Jasmine didn't speak right away. She looked at him, not like a guest, not like a politician, like a woman who had heard that exact phrase from 1,000 mouths wearing 1,000 different smiles. Then she turned, not dramatically, but purposefully, just enough to acknowledge the audience. Her voice didn't rise, her breathing didn't change, but her cadence, her precision, sharpened. Let me ask you something, she said. If I sit here and explain how certain systems push people to the margins, and your first instinct is to say I'm playing victim, what does that say about how you listen? A full beat passed, real silence now, not a cough, not a chuckle, not even a shuffle. Jasmine continued, I'm not oppressed because someone disagrees with me. I'm pointing out a pattern, and the moment I name that pattern, suddenly the conversation shifts to whether I'm being too sensitive, not whether the pattern exists. That's not debate, that's deflection. The camera caught Maher again. His expression faltered, just a flicker, but enough to register. Jasmine didn't look at him. She looked past him. Let's be real, she said. You've built a career saying the uncomfortable thing. You pride yourself on pushing back against the mainstream. But when a black woman does the same thing, challenges you directly, you don't call it brave, you call it emotional. A woman in the audience clapped, then another. Then a ripple of applause moved through the room. Maher lifted a hand, smirking in the way hosts do when they try to regain control. All right, let's keep it civil, he said. Jasmine turned back to him, voice calm as ever. I am being civil, I'm just not being small. The air cracked, not from volume, but from truth. A line that needed no performance, no spin, just presence. The kind of line that doesn't ask for applause but earns it. Maher sat back, exhaled sharply, part scoff, part surrender. He reached for his notes, but the way his fingers moved just a little too fast gave it away. He had lost rhythm, and the crowd knew it. Jasmine didn't push. She didn't need to. She adjusted her blazer, sat back in her seat, and waited for the next question. But the real shift had already happened. Not in what she said, but in what it stirred. Not in how she spoke, but in how she stayed. And the world, watching from 1,000 screens, had just begun to talk. The show had barely faded to black when the waves began. In the dressing room, Reese burst through the door, wide-eyed, Jasmine's phone in hand. You're trending, he said, not with surprise, but with urgency. Jasmine raised an eyebrow, peeled off her microphone with a practiced flick of her fingers. Already? She asked, not really needing the answer. Number 2 on X, Reese said, and climbing. He handed her the phone, where the screen lit up with notifications so fast they blurred into one another. Mentions stacking like dominoes, screenshots cascading across timelines, and front and center. A 15-second clip looping endlessly, her voice calm and clear. I'm not being small. It had already been cut into a dozen different formats. GIFs, memes, video snippets overlaid with dramatic music, white bold font, and the caption, "Say that again." Jasmine exhaled through her nose, not a sigh of relief, not frustration, just an exhale that knew exactly what this would become. "They're going to twist it," she murmured. "They already are," Reese replied, his fingers dancing over his own phone, skimming commentary in real time. "But you should see the comments. People are eating it up. This isn't just political Twitter, it's everyone." What didn't come, however, was anyone from production. No producer stopped by to thank her. No one offered a goodbye or handshake. Not even a glance from the control room. Just the same polite assistant from earlier, slipping through the door with a soft, "You're clear," and vanishing just as fast. Jasmine didn't flinch. She wasn't looking for a post-show debrief. On the ride back to the hotel, the messages started pouring in. Staffers, friends, colleagues. Some were proud. Others were stunned. One message from her old law school professor simply said, "Damn." Her mother, never one to waste words, had texted, "You were raised right. That man thought he had you figured out. He didn't." The warmth of that message lingered longer than the headlines that were already starting to break. The first one she saw wasn't unexpected. Congresswoman Crockett lashes out at Bill Maher in on-air clash. She stared at the words for a second. Lashes out. Of course. Every time a woman sets a boundary, it's violence. She handed the phone back to Reese with a soft shake of her head. Back in the hotel, Jasmine slipped off her heels and sank into the quiet. The room wasn't luxurious, just clean and muted and calm. She turned on the TV but kept the volume low, only to find herself staring at her own face, on screen, in silence. A news panel dissecting what had just happened. One analyst said, "This is why Democrats struggle. They alienate people with this tone." Another countered, "She didn't raise her voice once, she was surgical." Jasmine didn't listen for long. She rubbed the arch of her foot absently and reached for the remote. But before she could power off the screen, her phone vibrated again. Unknown number, DC area code. She let it ring twice, then answered. "This is Jasmine." A calm, male voice on the line. "Congresswoman Crockett, this is Ed Ramos at CNN. We'd love to have you on tomorrow morning for a follow-up segment on your appearance tonight." She didn't respond immediately. "I'll have my team get back to you," she said finally. "Thanks." After she hung up, Reese looked at her. "Want me to say no?" She paused for a beat, then said, "Tell them we'll think about it." That was the truth. She wasn't running from it. She just didn't want to be a moment, not when she was trying to build a movement. By morning, the wave had crested and cracked. The backlash came, of course it did, louder, sharper, more coordinated. By 7 a.m., new headlines had sprouted across every media outlet. Fiery exchange, Congresswoman torches Maher. Crockett clapback goes viral. Rising star or loose cannon. The same dance, different day. She sat at her kitchen counter back home in Dallas, reheated coffee in hand, the television on in the background, though she wasn't watching. She hadn't slept much. Not from anxiety, but from preparation. She knew exactly how the next 48 hours would go. Reese sat across from her, scanning his laptop. "There are at least 20 new interview requests," he said. "NPR, MSNBC, couple of independents. Even that guy from The Viewpoint wants you." "Skip him," she replied without looking up. "Already did." She turned to the window. The sun was just starting to stretch across the rooftops, soft gold light brushing the sky. It was quiet. Really quiet. "Do they want to talk policy?" she asked. Reese hesitated. "Mostly they want a reaction." She nodded. Of course they did. Jasmine wasn't naive. She understood how media worked, probably too well. It wasn't the coverage that irritated her. It was the reduction. A moment of clarity, born out of a long string of interruptions and dismissals, was now being chopped up and replayed as a savage takedown, a viral clapback, a made-for-TV mic drop. A man from the Capitol even called her office that afternoon, one of the gray-haired smooth talkers who always spoke in circles. He said he respected the spirit of her words, but cautioned that the press doesn't always treat these things kindly. Translation: "You made people uncomfortable. Don't do it again." But Jasmine wasn't shaken. She had walked into that studio knowing exactly what she was stepping into. What she hadn't predicted was the ripple inside her own ranks. An older congressman, someone she had once respected, tweeted about decorum and unity, never naming her, but everyone knew. The The commentariat followed, calling for restraint on both sides, as though calmly stating a boundary was the same as undermining someone on national TV. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't subtweet. She didn't go live. She stayed quiet, deliberately so. She met with her staff, made a few phone calls to organizers she trusted, zoomed into a high school civics class in Garland where one student said, "I felt seen." That was what they didn't put in the headlines. That was the real aftermath. Not the noise, the recognition. Still, it gnawed at her. The way people rushed to reduce what had happened to a meme, a moment, a punchline. No one wanted to talk about how much discipline it took not to shout, not to interrupt, not to give in to the primal urge to swing back harder. People underestimated how much strength it took to sit still and make your words cut without ever raising your voice. That night, she sat alone at her desk, the soft glow of her laptop casting long shadows. Emails, statements, interview prep. It could all wait. She reached for her journal, just a worn black notebook with creased pages and a leather cover. She opened to a blank page and wrote 5 words, not loud, just clear enough. Then she closed the book. She wasn't chasing the cameras. She wasn't ducking them either, but she wasn't going to let someone else decide what her clarity meant. The weight of that choice, the boundary she drew, the stillness she refused to surrender, would follow her long after the hashtag stopped trending. A week passed. The internet moved on. A celebrity scandal broke. A video leaked. A political gaffe exploded somewhere in Ohio. Jasmine's clip still surfaced now and then, shared with reverence by some, used as ammo by others. But the noise had thinned. Jasmine didn't mind. She never craved noise. What lingered for her were the small conversations that followed, the ones no one covered, the ones that mattered. A woman in her district, mid-50s, worked admin at a public school, pulled her aside after a town hall in Mesquite. She whispered, "I've sat in meetings where men talked over me for years. You said the thing I never could." She smiled, but her eyes held something deeper. "I just wish I'd said it sooner." Or the retired pastor from Longview who left a voicemail on her office line. "I didn't agree with you, but I respected how you carried yourself. That's how grown folks talk. Keep speaking plain." These were the voices that grounded Jasmine far more than any headline. These were the echoes she cared to follow, because they reminded her that what happened on that stage wasn't about a viral win. It was about setting a standard. There's a pressure that comes with being Jasmine Crockett. Not just as a politician, but as a black woman in rooms built to swallow her voice before she even speaks. People love to say, just focus on policy, as if identity is a detour instead of the context that policy lives in. Neutrality for her was a luxury she was never afforded. She thought about that when she sat with a group of college interns visiting from small Texas schools. They sat around a long table, wide-eyed, notebooks open. One young man from Lubbock asked, "How do you decide when to speak up and when to stay quiet?" Jasmine leaned back in her chair. "You don't wait for the moment to feel safe," she said. "You speak when the silence feels heavier than the risk." They scribbled it down, heads nodding. Another intern, a girl with nervous hands, asked, "How do you not get angry when people talk down to you?" Jasmine smiled. "I do get angry, but I've learned that anger doesn't have to be loud to be real. You don't always need volume to hold power." That wasn't from a speech. That was from experience. From rooms where her tone was picked apart more than her proposals. From days when she wanted to scream but chose silence, not because she was afraid, but because she knew the precision of stillness. After the session, the same girl lingered behind. "I want to run for office one day," she said softly, "but I don't think people will take me seriously. I talk fast. I get emotional. People say I care too much." Jasmine looked at her with something close to tenderness. "Keep caring," she said. "That's the part they're scared of." They stood together for a moment, the future looking back at the present, both shaped by the same storm. When the girl walked out, Jasmine stayed at the window, watching the city below shift and breathe. The streets were noisy, but in that moment she felt something else, something solid, something clear. She knew the words she spoke on that show had traveled far, but what mattered more was where they landed. Because that line, "I'm not being small," wasn't crafted for applause. It was built for reflection. It wasn't a jab, it was a declaration. A reminder that strength doesn't always roar, that clarity has its own gravity, that refusing to shrink is its own kind of power. And she was just getting started. By the time the next week rolled in, the moment had officially passed, for the media at least. The headlines had drifted toward a celebrity divorce, a new political scandal brewing in the Midwest, and some viral stunt involving a senator and a misfired tweet. But the echo of Jasmine Crockett's voice, steady and unyielding, continued to ripple beneath the surface where real stories live. Her clip still circulated in quiet corners of the internet, resurfacing on blogs, in Instagram stories, in late-night group chats where friends who had never once discussed congressional hearings now found themselves quoting a line they couldn't shake. It wasn't just what she said, it was how it landed. Not as noise, but as truth. Jasmine didn't chase it. She didn't repost the memes, didn't amplify the edits, didn't capitalize on the surge. What she did do was go back to work. Because that moment, for her, wasn't an end. It was an inflection point. Something had cracked, subtly but irrevocably. People were listening differently, not just to her but to themselves. In community meetings across her district, more hands started going up. The questions were sharper, the stories more raw. She noticed it in how people stopped her in the grocery store, not to congratulate her, but to thank her, for saying what they couldn't, for not shrinking, for holding the line. But with clarity comes cost. That became obvious when the backlash grew quieter but more pointed. Not the loud tweets or radio jabs, those were expected. It was the institutional frost that crept in slowly. Invitations that used to arrive didn't. Meeting rooms that once held space now felt colder. A few donors pulled back, citing tone concerns. Even some within her own party began using words like divisive and too sharp when they thought she wasn't listening. But she was always listening. That's what made her dangerous to those who preferred quiet obedience over principled dissent. Still, she didn't flinch. Instead, she started drafting new language for a community engagement bill that would redirect funding to underserved neighborhoods without waiting for federal filters. She partnered with local organizers, bringing them into planning meetings that had previously been reserved for consultants in suits. And she kept showing up at housing board meetings, school fundraisers, food drives, because she never forgot that leadership wasn't performance, it was presence. One evening, after a long day of back-to-back constituent calls, Jasmine sat alone in her home office. The walls were lined with photos, not of her shaking hands with big names, but of her mother holding a mop, her brother wearing a hand-me-down jacket, the church where she gave her first community speech at 17. She looked at one of the framed photos, her law school graduation. She remembered what it took to get there, the night shifts, the exhaustion, the meals skipped. She remembered a professor once telling her, "You have too much fire, you'll burn out." He was wrong. The fire wasn't what endangered her, it was what had kept her warm. Her phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from a high school teacher in Tulsa. The teacher had shown the clip of her appearance to her class, not for political debate, but to teach posture. "We talk a lot about bullying," the teacher wrote, "but we rarely teach what it looks like to stand up for yourself without striking back. Thank you for modeling that." Jasmine read it twice, then once more, slowly. It landed harder than any interview request ever could. Because that was the point. That was the legacy of the moment. Not that she had gone viral, not that she had out-talked a host on national television, but that she had shown something people didn't know they needed to see. That it's possible to be firm without being cruel, that you can set a boundary without breaking the room, that dignity doesn't always come with decibels. And even more quietly, something else was shifting. In homes across the country, people were watching the clip not for entertainment, but for something deeper. In Columbus, a teenage girl stuck a post-it note to her bathroom mirror with the quote scribbled in black Sharpie, "I'm not being small." In Detroit, a mother shared the clip with her daughter before her first job interview. In a small town in West Virginia, a community organizer used it to kick off a workshop on conflict resolution. These weren't fans, these were witnesses. People who saw themselves in her and for the first time saw permission. Permission to take up space, to correct gently, to speak plainly. But there was also another side, one that Jasmine knew too well. the skepticism, the framing. She read a blog post calling her a master manipulator of optics. Another described her as weaponizing civility, as if calmness could be a strategy instead of an instinct. The layers of projection piled on, and yet she said nothing. Because the point of speaking clearly is not to win the aftermath, it's to leave no room for misinterpretation in the moment. And then came the email, from a man in his 60s, rural Oregon, white, conservative. He wrote simply, "I don't agree with you on much, but I saw how calm you were. I've never seen someone take a hit and respond without throwing one back. That stuck with me." Jasmine read it 3 times, not because it surprised her, but because it confirmed what she already knew. Truth doesn't need a side to be recognized. It only needs to be seen. She began building something new, not a campaign, a curriculum. Partnering with educators and community leaders, she helped design a pilot program called Speak Plain, focused on civic discourse, self-respect, and how to navigate power without losing self. It wasn't flashy, it didn't draw headlines, but in the classrooms where it launched, something profound happened. Students who had been dismissed as loud found their tone mirrored in policy workshops. Young girls who'd been told they talked too much learned that clarity wasn't a flaw, it was a tool. Jasmine visited one of the pilot schools quietly, no cameras, no press, just a folding chair in the back of a classroom in Denton. She listened to a group of students present mock legislation. One girl stumbled over her first sentence, then caught herself. She took a breath, stood taller, said, "I'm not being small," and continued without apology. Jasmine didn't clap, she didn't interrupt, she just nodded once. And in that nod was everything. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about the ripple, the blueprint, the reflection. And that's the thing no viral clip can capture. That after the moment fades, the echo remains. Not as noise, but as a whisper that lives inside the people who needed to hear it most. There are stories that shape headlines, and then there are stories that shape people. This was the second kind. And Jasmine knew that meant her work was only just beginning. 3 weeks later, Jasmine Crockett stood before a crowd in a modest community center on the south side of Dallas. The linoleum floor reflected the overhead lights with a tired sheen, and the folding chairs creaked under the weight of parents, teachers, retired factory workers, and college students trying to balance purpose with fatigue. There were no banners, no press kits, no step-and-repeats, just clipboards, half-empty coffee cups, and an energy that hummed with anticipation. It wasn't the crowd size that mattered. It was the stillness, the attention, the way every set of eyes followed her as she stepped up without notes. She didn't need them. She wasn't here to impress. She was here to remember, and to make others feel remembered. She opened with a story, not about the show, not about Maher, not about the headlines, but about her first internship in the legal system. How she shadowed a public defender who represented a woman arrested for trespassing. A woman who had been living in an abandoned house with her 2 children. She worked night shifts cleaning medical buildings and made her kids do homework under a flickering hallway light. Technically, she was homeless. Technically, she was a criminal. But Jasmine never forgot her name. Never forgot the way the woman folded her hands in her lap and whispered, "I just didn't have anywhere else to go." The room was silent. Not the forced silence of political theater, but the kind of quiet that happens when truth touches memory. Jasmine continued, "I think about her every time someone calls public housing a handout. Every time someone talks about poverty like it's a choice. Every time someone tells me that tone is more important than content. Because that woman didn't need a lecture. She needed a door that wasn't locked." Later, during the Q&A, a man near the back raised his hand. He looked to be in his 70s, with weathered hands and the kind of stare that had seen hard years pass without asking permission. "When you said what you said on that show," he began slowly, "I heard my granddaughter in your voice. She's 15, talks back sometimes, too smart for her own good. But I showed her that clip and she just nodded and said, 'See?' And I realized I'd been trying to quiet her instead of hear her. So, thank you." His voice cracked on the last syllable. Jasmine didn't respond with a quote. She didn't fill the air with talking points. She just said, "Thank you for listening." Because sometimes that was the bigger act of courage, not the speaking, but the changing. That evening, As the sky turned the color of old brass, Jasmine returned to her office. She sat by the window, phone face down, and watched as streetlights blinked awake across the neighborhood. She thought about all the young girls watching her clip online, not because they wanted to go into politics, but because they wanted to learn how to stay standing when someone tried to bend them. She thought about the woman who had sent a voicemail days earlier. A nurse from Arizona who had been pulled into an HR meeting for being too assertive. She said, "I replayed your voice in my head and didn't apologize for defending myself." Jasmine played the message twice, once for clarity, once for conviction. What became clear to her in the quiet after the cameras was that this was never really about media or virality. It was about dignity, about the way women, especially women of color, are asked to trim themselves to fit rooms built for someone else's comfort. They are told to smooth their edges, lower their voice, frame their grief in manageable sound bites. And when they don't, the world calls it defiance, calls it rage, calls it everything but truth. She remembered once being told in a private meeting that she was hard to pin down. At the time, it stung. Now she wore it like armor, because being unpindownable meant being uncontained. It meant refusing to be someone else's version of respectable. It meant walking into a room, not with permission, but with presence. She carried that same presence into a closed-door meeting on Capitol Hill 2 days later, a round table about educational equity. She wasn't the only woman in the room, but she was the only one who had gone viral for setting a boundary. She could feel it in the way some colleagues looked at her. A flicker of caution, a second glance. One senior lawmaker, with a polite smile too tight to be genuine, said, "Let's try to keep things constructive." Jasmine didn't flinch. She simply said, "Constructive doesn't mean quiet. It means honest." Then she opened her folder and started talking about schools with leaking ceilings and textbooks older than their students. The room stayed silent, but not resistant, just different, just aware. Afterwards, one of the junior staffers approached her in the hallway. Young, nervous, eyes that darted before they landed. "I'm sorry," he blurted, "but I just wanted to say that clip meant a lot. My sister showed it to me. She said it was the first time she saw someone hold space like that without getting swallowed." Jasmine smiled. "Tell her I said she doesn't have to get small to fit in the room." He nodded, awkwardly grateful, then disappeared down the corridor like a shadow unburdened. The days that followed blurred into each other. Meetings, bills, late-night emails. But every now and then, the line came back. On bumper stickers, on T-shirts, scribbled in Sharpie on the back of a student's notebook. Sometimes it was attributed, sometimes not. Jasmine didn't care. She wasn't in it for credit. She was in it for impact. And impact isn't always explosive. Sometimes it's slow, quiet, a shift in how someone carries themselves into work, a mother speaking differently at a parent-teacher conference, a cashier refusing to smile when someone talks down to her, and instead standing tall in the truth of her own enoughness. Because the real legacy of that night on television wasn't about a congresswoman clapping back at a host. It was about reclaiming space, about saying, with precision and without apology, that tone is not the measure of truth, that civility doesn't require silence, and that boundaries, when clearly drawn, become invitations for others to rise, not recoil. Jasmine didn't need to remind herself of any of this. She lived it, every day, in every room, with every expectation stacked against her like a quiet dare. And still, she stayed grounded. Not because she hadn't been shaken, but because she knew how to rebuild herself from the inside out. One night, months after the moment had passed, she was in Houston speaking at a college forum. The topic was supposed to be voting access. But during the Q&A, a student asked, "What do you do when no one in the room wants to hear you?" Jasmine looked at her and said, "You speak like someone who's already been heard, even if they haven't caught up yet." The audience fell silent, not because they were stunned, but because they recognized themselves in that answer. And that, Jasmine knew, was the point. This wasn't about being the loudest. It was about being clear, about standing firm, about refusing to edit your worth to fit someone else's frame. And in that clarity, she had found not only her voice, but something more dangerous, something more lasting, influence. Not the kind that trends, the kind that lingers, that builds. that teaches others how to hold the mic without asking for permission. And that was just the beginning. It was late, close to midnight, when Jasmine Crockett found herself alone again in her office, the city outside her window humming its quiet song of streetlights and distant sirens. The building was dark except for the soft pool of light spilling across her desk, where papers lay untouched and a mug of tea had gone cold hours ago. She hadn't meant to stay this long, but time had slipped, as it often did when she was thinking not just about what had been said, but what had been left unsaid. There was something sobering about silence at the end of a long day, the kind that pressed in not to suffocate, but to ask, what now? She turned her chair slightly, facing the window, and watched a man walk his dog past the gate. The rhythm of his steps, the easy way the leash moved in his hand, it reminded her that outside of all the noise and debate, life continued. People still went to work before dawn, still waited for checks to clear, still hoped their kids wouldn't get sick because the ER wait was too long and the insurance deductible too high. That was the country she worked for. Not the one that watched, but the one that lived. And that's what the clip, the moment, had never fully captured. That it wasn't about clapping back, it wasn't about performance, it wasn't even about winning an argument, it was about bearing witness. To every moment she had been underestimated, spoken over, mischaracterized. To every woman who had been told her voice was too sharp, her ambition too loud. To every girl watching who didn't yet know she was allowed to be big. Jasmine had not set out to become a symbol. She had shown up to do the work. But sometimes the work finds its sharpest edge in unexpected places. Sometimes the very act of not shrinking becomes a form of service, a signal, a kind of light for people navigating the dark, looking for proof that holding your ground doesn't mean losing your grace. The messages still came in, not as many now, but deeper. A father in Pennsylvania wrote about his daughter who had watched the interview and said for the first time, "That's what I want to be like." A man in Georgia, who had lost his job during the pandemic and struggled to feel seen, wrote, "You said it so plain. I felt like you'd been sitting at my kitchen table." A teacher in Chicago used Jasmine's quote as the opening prompt for a lesson on civic courage. Write about a moment when you refused to be small. Jasmine read them all. And when she traveled to Austin, to Atlanta, to tiny districts in places no media ever mentioned, it wasn't the headlines people brought up. It was that one sentence, that one moment. They'd say, "You didn't even raise your voice." Or, "You sat so still and still made the whole room shift." Or, "You made me want to stop apologizing for being the way I am." And Jasmine would smile, thank them, and remind them that this wasn't about imitation. It was about unlocking something in themselves. "It's your mic too," she'd say. "Take it." Because that's the thing about clarity. It multiplies. It doesn't hoard power. It hands it off, palm to palm, like a relay. And what she had learned, what she knew now without question, was that the most lasting impact comes not from speaking the loudest, but from speaking the kind of truth that doesn't need to be repeated to be remembered. One afternoon, months after the hearing had faded from the news cycle, Jasmine visited a small town in East Texas. Not for a rally, not for a fundraiser, just to talk. The community center was full, but quiet. No podium, no production, just a circle of chairs and the scent of burnt coffee. Near the end, a girl stood, 16, maybe 17, with thick glasses and a notebook hugged tight to her chest. Her voice shook when she spoke. "I saw the video. I didn't know we were allowed to speak like that. I didn't know we were allowed to just be." Jasmine didn't interrupt. She let the girl finish. Then she nodded once, slow. "We've always been allowed," she said. "They just made us think we weren't." The room was silent, not out of awe, but out of recognition. That's when Jasmine knew that this, right here, was the real stage. Not the one with cameras, but the one where people finally started telling the truth about how tired they were of pretending, how long they'd been carrying the weight of being palatable, how much of their own voice they'd silenced just to survive. And from that silence, something new began to grow, a refusal, a rising, a resolve to stop asking for space and instead start building it. When Jasmine returned to D.C. the following week, she sat through another panel where voices circled each other without ever touching. She listened, waited, then spoke. Calm, clear, direct. The same tone. the same posture, no apology. And though the news cycle didn't pick it up this time, she didn't need them to, because she had learned something most people in power never do. You don't need a trending clip to tell the truth. You just need to mean it. The world will always try to make moments like hers smaller. We'll call them angry. We'll reframe them as divisive. We'll say the words only mattered because they got views. But they're wrong. The words mattered because they were real, because they were earned, because they reminded people that their voice, their anger, their clarity isn't something to hide. It's something to honor. And so when people ask what it was all for, why she said it, why she didn't back down, why she didn't match sarcasm with silence, Jasmine always gives the same answer. Because someone needed to. And if you're still wondering what to do with that story, ask yourself this. Where have you made yourself smaller just to stay in the room? Where have you bitten your tongue, not because you were wrong, but because you feared what they'd call you if you spoke? And then ask the better question. What would happen if you didn't? Because when you stop shrinking, when you speak plainly, when you stop adjusting your worth to fit someone else's comfort, everything shifts. People notice. Some will respect it, some will resent it, but none will forget it, and neither will you. So if this story moved you, don't just save it, live it. Say it out loud if you need to. Remember, you're not being small, you're being seen.